Drop your guard for the Doppelganger. Hey there, rats and cats, and welcome back to Invisobel Black Moon Musings, audio edition. This is the second of my newsletters from 2022. Well, it's actually about the fourth of my newsletters back then, but it's the second that I am recording. So if you're interested in the last one that I recorded a few weeks ago, it was straight as the crow flies. At the moment, it's just somewhere on my Instagram and Facebook, but it shall henceforth be other places, I believe, I hope. So this one is taken from April 2022 when we had a new black moon. And of course, just a few things I've had to modify based on what's going on in astrologically, although not that I know all that much about astrology, to be fair. But if you're new here and you're asking yourself, what, pray tell, Vanessa, is an Invisobel Black Moon Musing? Well, it's a good question. Let me read it out for you. It's a monthly new moon letter, not a newsletter, but a newsletter, moon letter, from me to you, where I dive down myriad rabbit holes and muse on what I find. To repeat the preamble for my newcomers, whilst these musings are not necessarily about Our Lady the Moon, I settled on writing for each new moon because she's the one we don't see. She dons her invisible cloak and reminds us that it's okay to take a moment to go into the darkness, recharge, and rebirth for another cycle. The gravitational pull is equally powerful with the new moon as for the full, so she's proof that you don't need to see her to know she's there. And regardless of whether you're pure science, spiritual, or or a concoction of both, I'm sure we can all agree that this fantastical ball of energy has a voice that can really pack a punch. So please take a seat, engage brain portals, and set your expectations to anything goes. As usual, my musings were many this month. There they were, rolling around in my head and getting tangled like a kitten with a ball of already tangled string. And then it all just fell into place. As I was walking through town one day, I had the experience of seeing 3 doppelgangers, or what we now casually refer to as such, in the space of a few minutes. And there it was. There was my theme. Doppelgangers, the epitome of duality in the metaphysical realm. A couple of years ago, this new moon was a black moon, which is essentially the equivalent of a blue moon, the second full moon in the same month, in that when it occurs, it's the second new moon in the same month. Being that each new moon, preceded by those delicious dark moon hours, is about rebirth, introspection, setting intentions and new beginnings, it follows that a black moon is just the supercharged version. New moon energy on steroids, if you will. This year we've just celebrated Beltane, and this May new moon is a super new moon, and it's in Taurus. Now, my knowledge of all things astrology is still quite limited, as I mentioned earlier, but I do know that Taurus energy is great at keeping us connected to what's going on in the here and now. Regardless of whether it's your average power-packed new moon or a supercharged new moon, the essence remains the same. They show us what doesn't matter anymore, so it can be cut away. And here in the sprouting, yet still at times frosty or snowy, spring of Norway, people have been out in the garden literally cutting away energy drainers from the plants so they could burst into new life. And just like the tasty goodness of the autumn leaves, for those down in the southern half of the world, dissolving into the earth, the spring cuttings can be chopped up and reused. I rather love this duality between the seasons, especially as an Aussie far from my first home. These perfectly cyclical energies of the life-death-life process are oddly comforting and help me feel some connection to my friends back there and to that distant red soil. This letter is essentially all about the notion of duality and shadows. Before I take you full pelt into my brain portal, I'll quickly throw at you all the dualities that smacked me in the face back when I started writing this, just to show precisely how big and connected this concept became and how I paired, see what I did there, them back to doppelgangers. Firstly, it was a black moon, as we said, the second of 2 new moons in the same month. We had a partial solar eclipse, which, whether you could see it or not, meant a giant cocktail of solar and lunar energy bubbling away for a few hours, mixing release and rebirth, rocket fuel energy. Now, because eclipses always travel in pairs, There was a lunar eclipse to follow a couple of weeks later, and it was, and has also just been, Beltane, whose opposite is Samhain, when the veils between the physical and spirit world are considered to be at their thinnest and most volatile. Duality, duality, do-frickin-ality. Okay, with all that said, let's get to the theme of the month. To be honest, I knew the concept of the doppelganger was going to be far from small, and I fell down rabbit holes I never expected to find. Honestly, I could start a dissertation on the topic, and many have, but what it sparked for me was all the connections surrounding duality in general. Perhaps it was precisely because of the energies that were swirling around at the time, and let's face it, it's been about the same now, just in different ways, that I had this experience, maybe as a reminder to look at things differently and to recognize and befriend the shadow side. Have you ever seen a doppelganger? If so, what was your experience? Did you see a version of yourself or someone else? Were you frightened, curious, wistful, excited, or just apathetic? Let's start with what a doppelganger is. Hailing from the German word Doppelganger, it translates to double goer or double walker, often appearing as a ghost-like figure and generally seen as a bad omen or signifier of... Sorry, it said insert metal growl here, so I was just obeying orders. Hilarious. Others say the apparition was an attempt of the spirit to provide advice to the person they shadowed, which is far less ominous and something I'll muse upon a little later. For now, it's rabbit hole time. Let's go diving. The term doppelganger only appeared in text at the end of the 18th century, coined by the German author Johann Paul Friedrich Richter in his book Siebengers. But the concept has been around as far back as the Ka in ancient Egypt, representing the life force or spiritual double of a person. In Europe and parts of Africa, there were the changelings, who were the supernatural children left in place of human infants, and then you have the Norse Svadögir, who were less ominous in nature in that they generally appeared just before the person it resembled actually arrived, a bit like a reverse déjà vu. Then there was the fetch, seen in Irish literature of the 18th and 19th centuries as an ethereal double, and that takes us back to the death omen side of things. If we head back to its use in literature, in particular the literary Gothic, like Wuthering Heights and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for example, it's more about the duality of the self and the shadow self. We hear a lot these days about the shadow self and the necessity of doing shadow work and shadow healing, and it's become the unfortunate victim of trend in our modern society. But the notion, like the term doppelganger, is as old as the hills and deserves some cred. Pause for breath. We're about halfway through, and this is a little longer than my average museletters, in case you're wondering, so please bear with me if you're still here. This was a tricky one for me to contain, but I did my best. And for the sake of clarity, the remainder of our little musing will look at the different ways that we can and do, or don't, face the dualities around us, with a little reference to my lady, the moon. The very fact that the fear of the shadow has existed for so long seems closely linked to us not understanding, not trusting what we can't see, and being taught so through stories passed down, or being convinced at certain points in history that spirit and healing equaled evil or witchcraft. The dictionary definition of shadow is the effect of interception of sunlight or a source of light. But there's one which is a tad more poetic that I rather like, described as partial darkness or obscurity within a part of space from which rays from a source of light are cut off by an interposed opaque body. An opaque body. Ooh, that gives me a metaphysical chill. Right, back to it. The shadow, like the Ka, was a really powerful, Ka as in K-A, not Ka as in C-A-R, brum brum, just to be clear. The Ka was a really powerful element to the ancient Egyptians, seen almost like a bodyguard. Just imagine, by shifting the notion of the shadow from being an ominous, looming monster into some kind of protector, what a power combo. The shadow as bodyguard, the shadow guard. And yeah, after a quick curiosity search, I see now that it's a thing in D&D and other fantasy worlds, at least the name Shadow Guard. I don't care, I'm rolling with it. There's an element of the macabre in the shadows and their darkness, but is that always so bad? And does it always need to be that way? When you approach someone or something defensively and with fear, that approach is often mirrored back to you, so maybe approaching that which we cannot see a little differently now and then, and yes, that often still requires caution, might just allow for the two worlds to stand autonomously and together at once. Remember, trusting in what you can't always see can mean many things, including the complex and highly intelligent root systems under our feet, or, like I touched on in an earlier issue, the intricate beauty of the nervous system under our very own flesh suits. Harking back to my mention of the thinning veils for Beltane, perhaps we can take a moment to consider that these thresholds can also be a meeting place between the elements of the two worlds. And perhaps it's in these liminal and shadow spaces where we can best let things go to make room for the new. Maybe we need to do a full renovation, or maybe just move the furniture around a bit and allow other parts of ourselves to take priority for a while. There is a wistful, sad beauty in the impermanence of things, and grieving is an important part of that. But we should always remember that it has a place. Perhaps this is a time to look at the shadow self, or just shadows in general, and celebrate them and their role in our lives. Allow the thinning veils to give you new sight and let light in through the cracks so your shadow can be seen. Maybe your shadow is your doppelganger, just not in human form. Imagine if our shadow came to life. I know, it sounds like the stories of nightmares, folklore, and doppelgangers of Gothic literature, but what if, at the dark of this new moon, it had time to gently acquaint itself with its environment as the days gradually lighten through the next lunar cycle? Just as the wheel turns and the seasons change, why can't this be a representation of the self and shadow self, balancing the two parts on scales, allowing their weights to shift and finding a way to coexist? We most often associate shadows with being beneath us, but they're just as often beside it or even above us. It all depends where the light's shining. Imagine the notion of combining the shadow to the self. I'm visualizing a zipper pulling the shadow up to oneself, but it doesn't feel right, does it? Aside from being perhaps a little creepy. They're meant to exist as mutual and separate entities simultaneously. They belong together and need each other, but their individuality needs to remain clear. My brain went a step further and visualized zipping the physical body down to the shadow, and that felt more frightening and controlling. But why? Because I assumed the shadow to be below, or simply because the shadow is a guide that should not control or be controlled? Neither of those roles are befitting of such an important character. Okay, you've made it this far, so it's time to wrap it up and say thanks for indulging in my brain chaos this month. I'll end with this. I don't think we're always in perfect balance, and I rather like that, because for me it's certainly the extremes of emotions that inform me of the depths of human nature. But it's definitely important to find balance, and regularly. Just like finding the calm in a storm, you and your shadow can find a place to sit happily, side by side, with a cheeky grin and a glass of wine. Can I leave you with one final thought? It's tiny, I promise. Well, the thought isn't, but my execution of it will be. I couldn't find a way to thread it neatly into the letter, but I had to share it. It's about the duality of time itself. I did say that the thought wasn't small. Cutting to the chase, an article was published 1 month before I wrote this back in 2022 about a team of scientists exploring a new theory involving the existence of a mirrored doppelganger called an anti-universe, where time runs backwards. I mean, science. But wait, does that mean we could finally time travel? Claire, I'm coming! Sorry, Outlander reference. Couldn't help myself. Anyway, see you down the next rabbit hole, Moon Muses. Thanks for being around. Last but not least, as I mentioned in the last audio edition, I am a freelancer. I'm a musician. I'm a composer. I'm a tarot reader. I'm a all-round strangeling, really. And I do have a wonderfully busy year unraveling before me, but there are times when things are a little more. So if you like what I do, you have an opportunity to buy me a cheeky coffee or two. So if you head along to my Ko-fi site, it'll be in the things underneath. I remembered it last time. I think it's ko-fi.com/Invisobel Black. I can't even remember. I just checked. It's right. I was right. Yeah. head along there if you fancy it. You can buy me a cheeky coffee. Sharing, if you want to share, is awesome. And you can even sign up to my moon letter, even though I haven't written any new ones yet, but I plan to as the year goes on. Yeah, I think I'll just stop waffling now and let you be. Happy new moon, or heavy new moon, but also good. It's a let go, work out what it like. Well, actually, full moon's a let go. New moon is setting intentions, but this particular one is also get rid of the baggage so that you can make the intention. So yeah, good luck with that. Ciao, ciao. I knew the concept of the doppelganger. To be honest, I knew that